So, album number 2, Answer Together. If you haven't heard an audio commentary, it's just where musicians go to circle jerk themselves. So there's a lot to love about covering pieces of music, and one of the most fun aspects for me personally is making or translating repeated hooks into a new style or variation of the original. Not in the sense of a hook that's a repeated main melody, but in the sense of a pattern that's repeated behind everything else. And in the case of Close in the Distance, the original track has a largely atmospheric arrangement, where most of the emphasis is put on the vocals and the melody, which meant there wasn't much to work with in terms of hook. So this was a great choice from 𝚃𝚐𝚐, it's not a criticism, as the emotional weight of the original song is carried through the vocals and the melody, and every other element of the track is just used to enhance the performance of the vocals, and it doesn't pull your attention away from it. So to make an instrumental version of a song like this, I knew I'd have to balance out the elements of the track a bit more, which led me to make a number of specific decisions as I progressed. One aspect of the original is a high repeated note that carries consistently through the piece, like a kind of tone setter, but it doesn't pull your attention away from the focus on the vocals. It's the riff that I play at the start of the track, the high note in that's what I'm referring to for the original. And that part's what inspired the riff you hear at the start and throughout most of my version, though I did choose to define the notes more to help give it more of a presence. I did that by utilising the chord tones that were inferred by the synths and the pads of the original track. Anyway, the rhythmic elements of this riff are also what I based the pattern of my drums and bass on. In fact, most songs are built this way, where different elements are created and like snowball into each other and inspire different areas of the track. Another feature of my tracks that I'm fond of doing is structuring them into clearly defined sections, like how this section is quite distinct from the one before it. This is simply, it's just a preference I have, as I find it more enjoyable to build a track that has a dynamic range and a dynamic flow. And this is chill hop / lo-fi, so there's only so much you can get away with before the genre shifts entirely, but it's something that I do like to adhere to and consider as I continue to make these covers and tracks. So a lot of people prefer their lo-fi and chill hop to be mostly static in its dynamic presentation, and that's the nature of the genre really, but I sit somewhere in between. If things get too out of hand, then it can become distracting and feel a bit out of place, but if the track is also too monotonous, then I'll struggle to keep it in my memory. So ultimately that's the goal of my style, striking a balance between distinct sections and doing my best to adhere to something that resembles a chill hop style. Yeah? Anyway, as for instrumentation, the piano, you'll hear it a lot in this genre of music and in this album. It really is one of the perfect instruments for this, because it can swoon you through mellow lows of a piece of music, and it can cleanly flow between melodic ideas and chord progressions, and it just sounds beautiful as well. This will lead us into Dynamis quite perfectly, as that's basically the only instrument in this second track. And I love the piano because it has such a good flexibility with the amount of dynamic range that it has. You can use it for like drops in instrumentation, but you can also use it to support other instruments and connect sections of a track. It's like a perfect casting choice. You'll hear a lot of delay in this track. It's basically an echo, and I use that a lot in my tracks. Anyway, let's talk about Dynamis. So 𝚃𝚘𝚐𝚎 is really cute. She's such an adorable character. On a slightly more serious note, I want to express like 𝚃𝚐𝚐 and Endwalker as a whole as being something I freaking love, right? I've never had such a strong emotional response to a story in my life. Endwalker, amazing. But this is a topic that can be easily, attached to nostalgia, your personal bias for the franchises, whatever. It's special to me. If it's not to you, whatever, who cares? So 𝚃𝚐𝚐 is like, I can't call it my favorite game because it's Final Fantasy XIV. It's like its own thing. You can't compare it to other games. Not in my mind, I can't anyway. So my original intent for Dynamis was to have an acoustic guitar driving the second half of the piece. this melody, in fact. As you can tell, this idea went completely out of the window. The main reason for that is because my guitar is a steel-stringed one, which meant it sounded very harsh and sharp alongside this gentle piano sound that I'd created throughout the original draft of the song. I tried to blend it in a bit better through mixing techniques, but I found that the editing process just ruined the sound of the acoustic, and I can go into more why that happened later when I talk about a different track. Anyway, removing the acoustic and reworking it to be this exclusively piano-focused piece was, I feel like, was the better choice, and I'm very pleased with the tone of the track. Yeah. Another instrument that I love using is the Celeste. You'll hear it in this track and in Answers, which is next. It's a cute sounding keyboard that most people associate with like a toy box, and I knew it should have a place in a theme like this, given the innocent aspect of 𝚃𝚘𝚐𝚎 character, because Dynamis is basically her theme, right? And there is a part in the original track where there's like stringed instruments come in and the chords change and the melody takes a break. And I chose to use this section to introduce the Celeste and also reference another main theme of Endwalker's expansion, Footfalls. It's slightly tweaked, but it's essentially the same thing. Anyway, now we're on to Weight of the World / Answers. And it was only a matter of time until I did Answers. It has such a long-standing place in the entirety of Final Fantasy XIV's life cycle, and it means a lot to many people and a lot to myself. The original version of this track, as you definitely know, it's a somber orchestration that develops into a more intense, almost rock track with choirs and like a dramatic tension. It's like a big sound. And I love the song, but I didn't want to take it down that route and chose to keep it more grounded, because the style of what you're hearing wouldn't be very consistent with that, so I kept it mellow. So initially it was going to be a simple, rather short loop using only the Answers melody, and it was going to be more like Lena's theme from the first album, where it's mostly just one melody line used in different ways and different instruments. But with how special this song is, I wanted to make something big out of it. So that led me into the idea of a multi-track blend of two franchises that are admittedly quite important to me. So 14 and Nier. It wasn't a difficult decision to do that, because at the time, during Shadowbringer's post-expansion stuff, they were very into the franchises, with the raid series that was happening. So deciding which track to put with Answers was the main thing, of course, and it was 𝚘𝚐𝚐𝚎 himself that inspired my decision, of course. And the reason is kind of convoluted, actually, so bear with me. 𝚘𝚐𝚐's arrangement of Kaine's theme, blended with the theme of Final Fantasy, was my source of inspiration. Not only for just combining the two iconic pieces of music, but for the competence in how he did it, and the technical aspect. So, for those of you unaware, I'm about to go into why it's technically quite skilled. So Kaine's theme is written in the waltz time signature 3/4, and the theme of Final Fantasy is written in the most commonly recognized time signature, which is 4/4. Most of your pop songs are in 4/4. So what 𝚘𝚐𝚐 did was use the theme of Final Fantasy as a passage within Kaine's theme, but he adjusted the time signature to fit with Kaine's 3/4. That might sound like, oh, that can't be that hard. It's not as simple as just slapping it there and calling it a day. The notes need to be specifically rearranged and repositioned to meet the newly emphasized beats, because the 3/4, which means the specific beats are emphasized differently, so you need to twist the notes and where they're placed, so you ensure everything fits well. Also, chords and harmonies might not mesh after you've transposed them, so that needs to be adjusted too. So I took that concept and applied it to Weight of the World, the main theme of Nier Automata. So it was kind of an inverse, the main theme of Final Fantasy with a Nier song, and in my version I had the main theme of Nier Automata with a 14 song. I just thought it was kind of cool. Anyway, the reason all of this is relevant is because Answers is in 3/4, the waltz time signature, and Weight of the World is in 4/4. So he inspired me to essentially do the exact same thing he did, but for a combination of different pieces of music. It also goes without saying, and you've probably noticed, that Prelude is twisted and molded in various ways in this piece of music. So it's essentially more like a three-way mashup, but it's not a particularly difficult thing to mix Prelude in, which kind of goes contrary to what I did just say. But Prelude is shockingly easy to transpose into other just melodic ideas. And in fact, maybe that's why Final Fantasy games always have Prelude everywhere. Have you noticed that? It's really consistent how much Prelude there is in this franchise, no matter what song. Anyway, so Weight of the World, it's honestly an incredibly powerful piece of music to me, and to many other people as well. It's a very famous song, and I got the true ending to 𝚃𝚐𝚎𝚑 ending. Is it E? Yeah, I think it's E. I mean, all I need to say is the final credits, and you'll know exactly what I mean if you've been there. I love that game. So I decided to use the introductory chords and riff of Weight of the World as like a backdrop for the prelude and answers sections of the arrangement. I'm quite proud of how that came together. It sounds nice. It's like they blend almost perfectly. You hear in various parts here, the prelude, you can hear it. It's connecting a bunch of phrases and stopping and coming in between and matching the chords that are beneath it. It's very easy to make prelude work in that way just because of the nature of it. It's just a scale, so it's very easy to fit into other chords. In fact, if you love Weight of the World as much as I do, check out Crow covers, or is it Crow's covers? Crow covers. They have a fantastic rendition of the song. Anyway, next we're going on to And Love You Shall Find. And as far as 14 tracks go, And Love You Shall Find is quite an odd track for me, honestly. I mean that in the sense that I never played through the section of the game where it was actually first introduced. And for those of you that don't know, it was introduced in an optional area, an optional quest line. The area is called Turncliff, and it's in the post-Shadowbringers quest line, a trial quest line, I believe. So the first time I heard this piece of music was actually when we go to Garlemald in Endwalker. I have a very vivid memory of a certain cutscene in that snowy wasteland. It's the one that primarily focuses on Euless and Xenos, with a couple of other exchanges with the rest of the party. And hearing this track behind that fantastic scene, honestly, it left me speechless. I remember I said to myself, wow, that was a really sick scene. I said it to myself after the scene, there was no one with me. It's the scene where Xenos says something quite striking. What meaning there is to be found in the petty vicissitudes of your existence must be gleaned by you and you alone. I wrote that down. It's quite profound, because you can easily perceive him as quite a one-note character, and I think Endwalker did a good job of kind of giving him a bit more, like he's still him, but it explains him better, and that's cool. Anyway, the song itself it's hauntingly beautiful, and I struggle to define it with any other words. Hauntingly beautiful. It's the exact right amount of solemn that speaks to me in music, and it gripped me the moment I heard it, and it hasn't let go. So the main hook for the original is it's the opening line, because it carries through a large portion of the track, and a lot of the ideas are based around that and so on. So naturally, this is where almost the entirety of my inspiration for this cover came from. Throughout the section in which this riff plays, I chose to pick out specific notes of the riff for the bass to play in octaves below. That's like the same notes but much lower down. That's what an octave is. It's the same note but lower. That's also how I built the drum pattern, having the kick drum emphasize specific parts of that riff. And speaking of the riff, I played the riff itself through my keyboard, and I spent a long time editing it until I was happy with this kind of plucky koto-inspired instrument that you hear in the track. It's a very Eastern sound, Japanese, I think the instrument's originally. Anyway, tangent now. One thing I've always loved is the sound of a theremin. It's a very curious instrument that you play without actually touching it. If you use your hand and you wave it, it's like you're composing it. It's very conducting rather. Sorry. It's got a very interesting timbre to it. It's got a very interesting tone, and I've wanted to use in my music for a long time. But getting a good theremin, it's not exactly cheap And the learning to play one it's not easy either, like from what I've heard. Of course, I can't buy one, I'm not rich. So this is what led me to try and create my own through synth editing. And it was only for this track only. Why this track? Why go for all the effort for this track? Well, there are two reasons. So the first is that the main melody line is it's laid over the riff, and they actually clash because they're within the same octave range, so they're all the same group of notes, but they're also the same instrument. They're all on the piano, and that can be problematic. So 𝚃𝚐𝚐 or whoever mixed or arranged this track were clearly very careful with how they mixed it, as the melody oftentimes forces the riff out of the way through the means of compression or something like that. It essentially means if this was played by a real person, it would definitely sound different, and the main melody would struggle to stand out, I think. That's why a lot of piano covers you hear, the right hand, the main melody is played higher up, so it's more distinct. You'll notice that if you listen to covers of the track. So in later parts of the original, there are some incredibly soft and honestly beautiful melody lines that sound like they're being played on a stringed instrument, and the sound of that instrument it's so stunningly subtle that it was another source of inspiration for the theremin sound that I wanted to go for, because theremins are known to be soft and subtle when used appropriately anyway, because they can sound quite silly if you mess with them. Anyway, the in-game version has a big shift when the female vocal comes in, the bit that's coming up in my version now, and the rhythmic piano of the original changes to like intermittent pizzicato stabs that imply a chord progression and let the vocals carry out the part. Due to the fact that I used the theremin sounding instrument in the earlier parts of my track, I instead opted to do the opposite basically and let the rhythm section take the center stage for the ending of mine. The koto, harp and piano come together and play the melody and the chords just like you heard, and the bass and the drums take the role of the pizzicato stabs that you hear in the original. So if you listen closely to the pattern of the bass and the drums in my version, the bit that you just heard, you will hear that they mimic the pattern of those stabby strings from the in-game release. Yeah, it's very, I'm a fancy boy. Anyway, moving on to the next track. So we're on to Heaven's Tower now. Fabulous. This was one of the first tracks. No, this was the first track written for this album. And I mentioned this next point in Distant Worlds Together, the audio commentary of that album. I've still never played FF11. It's the only numbered game that I haven't played. That being said, the music from this game is always a treat to come across, to find. Like I'll happen across a track and I'll love it, or I'll be sent a track. And it'll be from 11, and it's like I'll find out it was from 11 or something like that. It's weird how many times it's happened where a track has really resonated with me, and it's been from this game that I haven't played. It's just a weird coincidence. Anyway, I found Heaven's Tower through a playlist that was about 8 hours long, and it was packed with chill and ambient Final Fantasy music. And this one track was like, ooh, it's got like a trance-inducing kind of feeling to it. It's like dreamlike, and it like stuck with me on loop for days after I heard it in my mind. Anyway, after receiving a request for it, I thought, yeah, of course, why not? I mean, having I had a few ideas that I could execute. I feel like I could do quite competently. So. On to another point, as I mentioned earlier, I enjoy repeated supporting hooks in a track, and Heaven's Tower it's essentially a perfect example of that, isn't it? Because the whole thing is basically an array of repeated lines that weave together and layer up in this wonderful way. And this fact about the song it's likely what makes it so addictive to listen to, right? I feel like this, when I was making it, I felt as though it would sound really nice on an acoustic guitar. So the very first thing I did was learn the parts on my acoustic and record them. Not every part, but most of the parts. And then later I would choose which parts sounded best with the acoustic. I mean, ultimately only 2 riffs ended up being used, and you hear them both in the first 10 seconds of the track. But it was a good thing to do that, so I could compare does this part sound better on a piano, things like that. So the track was built around the acoustic sound, which isn't always what you should do, but it's what I did with this one. And one of the biggest challenges with balancing this track specifically, and lo-fi in general, is just balancing the instruments. With this style of music, there are so many mids to balance, and I'll help define what that means for you if you're unfamiliar with the terminology. Different tracks are comprised of different frequency ranges, typically bracketed into 4 or so, but I'll just say 3 for simplicity. The high end, the mids, and the low. Things that have a low frequency range, as you'd expect, are bass guitars, kick drums, and things like that. Mids are pianos, harps, keyboards, things like that, and sometimes guitars, depending on what kind of guitar. And high sounds, they're sharper, like a cymbal hi-hat or a steel-stringed acoustic, though they can vary, like I said. So with this track, there are tons of keyboards, synths, pads, pianos, all of the mid things. So the reason why something like this is tricky to deal with from a production standpoint is because there are too many elements in that one frequency range, and it can cause audio problems like muddying a track or hurting the listener's ears or making instruments just disappear from the mix entirely. So countering it takes quite a lot of practice and very careful listening to train your ear for it, and also listening to it on different sound devices. There are a few ways to beat it, but the main one I used is called frequency slicing, and I also used in the next song, Sanctuary of 𝚃𝚘𝚎, so forgive me for spilling over into this one on this point. So frequency slicing, let's say I take the frequency range of a piano that is unpleasantly resonating with the harp. The mix will sound much better and much cleaner because I did that. This can be troublesome because if you remove too much of a frequency from an instrument, then it will no longer sound like a faithful, realistic version of that instrument. It will just sound wrong. Like when I tried to fix Dynamis, the acoustic in Dynamis, it just sounded wrong, so I had to just remove it altogether. That's the main thing with Heaven's Tower, is a struggle. Anyway, Sanctuary of 𝚃𝚘𝚎, this track. So given that I can play and record the acoustic at any time, it might surprise you that I actually didn't intend to use one for this track at first, especially when you consider the fact that the backbone of the original is an acoustic guitar, like it goes all the way through the track. Anyway, my original intent was a lot less groovy, for lack of a better word. It was much more somber. And I know it's still quite dark sounding, but the route it took as I was writing the drums led it to have a much bouncier feel. And I actually love this aspect about the cover, because it brings an energy to the piece that's very different from the original. All those hi-hats, very cool. It doesn't betray the heart of the original, in my opinion. Anyway, as the track progressed, I felt like the need for an acoustic kind of grew and grew because of the feeling that was going on. It didn't feel as somber as I originally intended, so I was like, I could probably put an acoustic somewhere. And as I went on and on with the track, I knew exactly where it should be. I knew it had to be emphasized, and I felt like it should be positioned in the second run through of the main melody, giving it like time in the spotlight, and allowing that section to stand out on its own, especially when contrasted with this calm section that you're hearing now. So it would emphasize it when it came in, give it a bit of impact. After I got through those parts, I considered going back to earlier areas and adding the acoustic to them, but ultimately thought that would kind of lessen the impact of this part, the point of this part. So instead, I just ended up playing the backing keyboard part on my acoustic and put it in the outro, and I just got to work, recording that. And it took quite a long time to get a take that I was happy with. It took even longer than Vinyls theme in the first album, which has a lot of acoustic. Anyway, I really enjoy a certain aspect about my performance in this version, the acoustic, and that is the way I hit the highest notes of the chords and let them stand out above the rest. You'll hear it shortly. I'm not the best guitarist, but I'll take pride in this one. So this track, it had a lot of layering to it. So in one example, there's a high piano following the entire melody of the track that never actually goes away. It even accompanies the lead acoustic on the second run through of the melody, and I did this to allow every different instrument to have like a consistent feel. It kind of unified them away and gave them a very specific ambience that persisted throughout the whole track. There's one thing I want to quickly touch on now that I'm at the end of the track, and there's a high scritchy sound to the acoustic guitar that didn't I had to change that. It was too high-pitched sounding in the original version, and in the album release that you'll hear on Spotify, and in this version, it's lessened. It's still there because it sounds nice, but I just kind of nerfed it a bit because it was too harsh on certain earphone types. That's the problem with mixing this kind of thing, because if you don't listen on one specific type of earphone and then someone else does, they'll hear something quite bad, and you'll be like, you wouldn't know it ever happened. Anyway, Hollow Skies / The Price of Freedom. I love Hollow Skies and I love The Price of Freedom. Perfect. On 7 Remake, when you first hear this track in the, is it 6? It's when you see Aerith. It's just, I just love the sound of this track. It's got that kind of somberness that I spoke about earlier that I like in a piece of music. Anyway, The Price of Freedom, it's the other part of this track, was definitely bound to happen at some point. Though I wasn't expecting to blend it with another track, let alone Hollow. But as I was learning how to play Hollow, I couldn't help but realize the similarities between the songs, because I already knew how to play The Price of Freedom. Like, not only are they both rock tracks that are driven by an acoustic guitar, but they're also in the same musical key. They're both in E minor, which is the preferred key of an acoustic guitar, because they're set to E. I don't know if you ever tuned a guitar, but everyone's like, it's E at the top and the bottom. Anyway, the first thing I'd like to touch on is the way I wrote the percussion and the bass line for this track, as they're quite distinct from the original. If you listen to the strumming pattern of the backing acoustic guitar from the original Hollow Skies, you might notice a similarity it shares with the drums I wrote for that whole first section. The connection was stronger at first, but I tweaked it a bit over time to what it is now. It's like I said right at the beginning of the commentary, specific elements of a track can inspire other elements in ways that you wouldn't have expected, and that goes for inspirations that you take from other composers' works too. Kinda cool. So you might have noticed that I had fun foreshadowing the melody in other areas of the song. I don't have much to say on why I did that, but I really like the fact that I did. It made for a good transition, it's catchy, and it unifies the track together in quite a nice way. Next point. I knew that this track should be the last track, if Close in the Distance wasn't, due to how the ending kind of leaves me feeling. It left me feeling a similar vibe to how Lulu's theme and left me feeling in the first album. It's got like that coldness that doesn't quite resolve, and I do really enjoy endings like that. Endings that don't finish, like they end but they don't conclude, if you know what I mean. There's no resolution. I really love that. I also may have gotten a bit carried away during this section of the piece, the Price of Freedom section of the piece, because it's kind of pop sounding, isn't it, in its execution. And the drum sound, it's similar to Heaven's Tower. It's got, I don't want to say drum and bass sound, but it's a heavy drum sound. And I just wanted it to feel uplifting, and the melody of Price of Freedom just kind of allowed that to happen kind of really easily. I also love how I combine mixing the melody of both the tracks in this section. I'm really proud of that, really cool. So along with the similarities it has to Hollow, there is another reason why I chose to have it, and that is the reason that the chorus to Hollow, to me, when I was doing it, didn't translate very well into chill hop, or whatever this track is, because the style's kind of become, you know... The chorus to Hollow is mostly just very long notes that are carried by the vocalist's execution. It's a chorus that's designed to have a big impact, but that isn't the direction I wanted to take it, or rather that's not the way my version wanted to go. And that's the ending. Would you look at that? I suppose when I release this, the album should be on Spotify. If it's not, then keep an eye out. It should be very soon. Stay cool.